Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. Last week, we finally saw Peter Daszak testify before Congress. He's the president of EcoHealth Alliance, the shadowy group through which Anthony Fauci funded reckless gain-of-function experiments at the Wuhan lab. It did not go well for Daszak, who was finally forced to admit that contrary to what he had been claiming for the past 4 years, he actually has no idea what kinds of viruses the Wuhan lab has. A lot of attention, especially on Twitter and in conservative media, has rightly focused on this belated confession. But there's something else that happened last week which has received less attention but is far more significant. House Republicans finally released the transcript of their deposition of Ralph Baric, the man who taught the Wuhan lab how to manipulate viruses. We've analyzed the transcript, and it is nothing short of breathtaking. We've long advocated for Ralph Baric to be hauled before Congress to testify about his role in fostering the creation of COVID, or perhaps even his role in creating COVID, and his role in covering up the pandemic's origin. Baric managed to escape the spotlight for 4 long years, but that wasn't going to last forever, and Baric was finally deposed by the Congressional COVID Select Committee, which has now released the 212-page transcript of what Baric told Congress in private and under oath. The reason why this should have all happened a long time ago is that Ralph Baric has been publishing coronavirus papers since 1984. That's long before the Wuhan lab or anyone else knew anything about these viruses. Baric is the world's foremost coronavirus expert. No one else even comes close. In fact, Baric has written more coronavirus papers than everyone else combined. He's also the godfather of gain-of-function experiments. He's been manipulating viruses for decades and developed stunning new technologies, most notably the ability to create new viruses in a lab without leaving any traces. And perhaps most importantly of all, he taught the Wuhan lab the highly advanced techniques which he himself developed. He even did a study in 2015 with the Wuhan lab's director Shizheng Li that modified coronaviruses to make them more dangerous. It was that paper which set off warnings about a man-made pandemic. Baric also co-authored the 2018 diffused blueprint for making COVID-like viruses together with Shizheng Li and Peter Daszak. So let's sum up. Baric knew the most about coronaviruses of anyone in the world. He had developed the technology to create new coronaviruses in a lab without leaving a trace, and he had drafted a blueprint for making COVID in a lab, which he shared with the Wuhan lab. If there was one person in the world that needed to be consulted, or perhaps interrogated when the pandemic started, it was Baric. Yet very curiously, Fauci did not invite Baric to be a public part of his secret teleconference on February 1st, 2020. A teleconference which, according to Fauci, was convened to investigate the origin of COVID. Why would you not invite the world's premier expert on the topic? We've asked that question many times on this show. Our answer, up to now at least, was that Baric knew perfectly well that the pandemic started in a lab and did not want to get dirtied up by the cover-up. To put it more bluntly, Baric didn't want it knowing that his technology caused the pandemic, and neither did Fauci. If Baric had put his name on that effort to cover up the Wuhan lab leak, people might have seen the connections between him and the Wuhan lab. It was safer for Fauci to invite lower-level scientists whose conclusions and answers could be molded by Fauci, which is exactly what happened. But as it now turns out, that was not the full story. In newly released testimony given to the House Select Committee on COVID, Baric now admits that he was part of the February 1st teleconference. How is that even possible? We have the emails inviting people to the secret teleconference. We have the replies. Baric's not mentioned anywhere. The answer points to an even deeper web of lies and deceit on the part of Fauci and Baric. Unless Fauci had 2 secret teleconferences on February 1st, and there's no evidence that he did, Baric was listening in on Fauci's secret teleconference, but without the others knowing that he was there. The only people who appear to have known about Baric's involvement in the secret teleconference were Fauci, his boss Francis Collins, British Pharmaceutical Trust Director Jeremy Farrar, and Patrick Vallance, who was the British version of Fauci. And this finally also solves another riddle we've been pondering for the past few years. We knew from previously released emails that during Fauci's secret teleconference, the head honchos, that means Fauci, Collins, Farrar, and Vallance, took a break during the call to discuss something that the other participants weren't supposed to hear. We always wondered what that was, and it now looks as if those men took a break to consult with Barrick. So rather than Barrick being excluded because he knew the truth, Barrick was an integral part of the cover-up. But for reasons that are self-explanatory, he did not want to be the public face of the cover-up. The two papers that came out of the secret teleconference, the fraudulent Lancet letter written by Daszak and Farrar, as well as the fraudulent Proximal Origin paper that was stealth edited by Fauci but published under the names of his Fauci-funded scientists, are on their face absurd. We've discussed those papers on the show before and won't rehash the details here. But it seems pretty obvious that Barrick did not want to be associated with those papers, at least not publicly. But as we now know from Barrick's newly published testimony, he did nevertheless secretly participate in the cover-up. For his part, Fauci aided and abetted in this scheme by pretending not to know who Barrick was. That claim, which Fauci made under oath in a deposition in the free speech case of Louisiana versus Biden, was always preposterous.
Do you know Ralph Barrick?
Not really. I know who he is. I doubt if I've ever met him. I may have met him at one of the meetings where there are thousands of scientists saying hi to each other.
There's simply no way that Fauci did not know the world's foremost coronavirus expert, especially after the outbreak of a coronavirus pandemic. And indeed, as it now turns out, Fauci knew Barrick well. Not only did Barrick admit in his testimony that he was at Fauci's secret teleconference to discuss the origin of COVID, but he also admitted that a few days later, he personally visited Fauci in Fauci's office. That means we have two diametrically opposed statements, both made under oath. But given the existence of a calendar entry that confirms Barrick's version of the story, it can now be proven beyond any reasonable doubt that Fauci lied under oath. But there's still more. One of the biggest concerns Fauci had about his funding of the Wuhan lab being exposed as the cause of the pandemic was the Barrick and Shi Zhengli paper from 2015, which we mentioned earlier. In a panicked email to his assistant on the morning of the day of the secret teleconference, Fauci literally attached the Barrick and Shi paper with the subject line, Barrick, Shi, et al., Nature Medicine, SARS gain of function. Fauci knew exactly who Barrick was. So what else did Barrick reveal in his newly released testimony? Quite a lot, and none of it is good for Fauci or for Barrick. Perhaps the second most important fact to come out of Barrick's under oath deposition, other than that he was at the secret teleconference, is Barrick's admission that the Wuhan lab had access to secret SARS virus backbones. That means backbones which they didn't publish and that no one in the West knew about. By the way, Daszak made the same admission during his testimony last week. Contrary to his previous claims, Daszak now says that he doesn't know what went on at the Wuhan lab, that he hasn't actually seen any databases, and that he had no access to the Wuhan lab samples. These admissions are hugely important because the entire rationale for claiming that COVID came from nature, in fact, the only rationale, was that COVID does not have a previously known backbone. In layman's terms, the backbone means the basic genetic makeup of the virus to which bits and pieces can be added in a lab. The fraudulent Proximal Origin paper touted the fact that COVID has an unknown backbone as dispositive proof that the virus must have come from nature. But given that even Daszak and Barrick now admit that the Wuhan lab had thousands of unpublished virus backbones and the ability to create new ones, that entire argument is dead. Another huge revelation made by Barrick was that he now admits that COVID could have come out of a lab and that the Wuhan lab's biosafety was totally inadequate. You can't rule out escape from the laboratory because they do work at biosafety level 2. Those are Barrick's words, not ours. Incredibly, we now also have an email from Barrick to Daszak, in which Barrick blasts Daszak for pretending that biosafety level 2 is adequate when playing around with dangerous coronaviruses. Don't insult my intelligence by trying to feed me this load of BS. Barrick also admitted that COVID did not start at the Wuhan seafood market because the cases there were at least 2 months after the initial outbreak. But it wasn't all just admissions from Barrick. While it is true that Barrick's testimony is generally that of an exasperated man who's upset that the Wuhan lab did really stupid things with the technology and know-how they got from Barrick, there's one issue where Barrick's exasperation turns into evasion, and to be quite frank, into plain dishonesty. That issue is the diffused blueprint for making COVID in a lab. Barrick now claims that when COVID emerged, he somehow forgot about the blueprint. That statement simply does not pass the smell test. Barrick was completely obsessed with finding a SARS virus with a furin cleavage site, as were Shi Zhengli and Peter Daszak. It was known within virology circles that a furin cleavage site could dramatically increase a virus's virulence, so this was an area of great interest. But despite looking at more than 1,500 SARS viruses, they never came across one with a furin cleavage site. In fact, to this day, no one has ever found a natural SARS virus with a furin cleavage site. Since nature didn't give them what they wanted, Barrick, Shi, and Daszak decided to create a SARS virus with a furin cleavage site in a lab. That is exactly what the diffused proposal was all about. What's more, the lab that was going to make this virus was the Wuhan lab. In fact, the plan was to lie to U.S. authorities by saying they would use Barrick's lab in North Carolina, and then, as soon as they got the money, they would shift the work to Wuhan. And then, a year later, the exact virus, which they could not find in nature, turned up in Wuhan, exactly where they were going to construct it in a lab. Now, even if we assume that Barrick was not directly involved with making COVID, and that the Wuhan lab took the diffused blueprint and just went ahead on its own, there's no chance whatsoever that Barrick forgot about his blueprint. It's impossible. It would be like searching for a unicorn, and then once the unicorn turns up, you forget that you had a blueprint for engineering a unicorn in a lab. The only conclusion to be drawn from Barrick's deception is that he knows perfectly well that the Wuhan lab took his blueprint and made COVID, causing untold damage and death. Perhaps Barrick feels guilty, but that does not absolve him. The fact that there is such a contrast between his very conspicuous annoyance with the Wuhan lab in general and his equally conspicuous evasion on the topic of diffuse tells us that diffuse is Barrick's weak spot. He knows a lot more than what he says and should be hauled back in and intensely questioned on everything to do with diffuse. For starters, what was Barrick, along with all the other diffuse authors, doing at the Wuhan lab right after U.S. authorities refused to fund the diffuse proposal? Why did the diffuse gang have a call with Fauci in October of 2019 right after COVID leaked? What was discussed on that call? There are many more questions, but the main takeaway from Barrick's admissions, as well as his evasions, is that diffuse ought to be the focus from here on out. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Truth Over News.